I want to ask you this morning to use your imaginations. Can you imagine? There are a lot of things I want to put into that picture right there, the one that I want you to imagine. I want you to imagine first the affliction that was being talked about by Isaiah, being written about by Isaiah, when he said, "In all their affliction, he was afflicted." We get the idea that we live our lives in isolation, that we're either with someone or we're alone. And I would challenge you to read the Bible, because we are never alone. Amen. And as we read Isaiah, where Isaiah is reminding this rebellious people, Isaiah was 845 years before Christ. Somewhere in that neighborhood he wrote this, and why he was writing to them was because they were rebellious. They were turning from the Lord. They had turned from the Lord, and they were about to be punished for it. Isaiah is reminding them of how faithful God has always been, how God has always been there for them. And when they were in desperate need in Egypt, God saved them from Egypt. And it begins in that passage saying how his loving kindness and his mercy caused them to be saved from that situation. God didn't necessarily do it in person, but he had it done. And it says, in all their affliction, he was afflicted. Have you ever said to someone, "I feel your pain"? Have you ever thought that you sympathize? When Bill was telling that story about the people on the road right behind them, I felt that pain. I know what it's like to lose someone. I know the feeling that there is when you are desperately hoping for someone's salvation and it doesn't come. I understand those feelings of helplessness, those feelings of wanting help from somewhere. I understand that the Lord felt those feelings for these people in Egypt. So when it came a time when the Pharaoh no longer remembered Joseph, and they began to turn against the Israelites, and they began to want to stamp them out or cut them way back in their strength, they began killing the babies. I can understand the Lord's feelings about that. I can understand the Lord saying, "I feel your pain." I can understand the empathy that the Lord had, the feeling of their actual pain. I can understand the sympathy that the Lord had in wanting to do something about that, the pity that he felt for what was happening to his people, the anger that he felt toward those who were doing those things to his people. And then we read the story in Acts chapter 9, and I want to read from verse 4 of Acts chapter 9. Saul of Tarsus was on the way to Damascus to get Christians, to put them into prison, to take their property from them, to kill some of them, to do whatever he could to stamp out the name or the cause of Christianity. So when the light fell upon him, and it shocked him, so it says he fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" The level of closeness that I see in this passage, that the Lord Jesus feels about his people, is that they were not persecuting his people, they were persecuting him. He says, "Who are you, Lord?" I don't know who Saul initially thought that was, but I guarantee you he knew that he was far superior to him. Because he calls him Lord here doesn't mean that he recognized him as God. It means that he recognized him as someone far greater than he was, and coming out of the heavens with that bright, blinding light was enough to startle Saul into submission. And Jesus said, I am Jesus whom you are persecuting. The reality of that sank into Paul's heart, to his very soul. And he realized what he had been doing, realized how bad a position that he now was in. Not only that, but Saul now realizes what he has done to all of God's people in doing what he was trying to do to Christ. So in Acts 26, beginning in verse 9, he says this to King Agrippa. So then I thought to myself, remember how we were talking this morning in class, how we have these conversations with ourselves? And we say, I think I ought to, well, what do you think about, do you really want to do that? We talk to ourselves like this. Right now, my grandson's talking to himself. When we have these conversations with ourselves, we come to a decision about what we're going to do. At the time Saul was having these conversations with himself, he had it in his heart that he had to do anything he could to destroy this blasphemous cause of this fake Messiah. I thought to myself that I had to do many things hostile to the name of Jesus of Nazareth. He had heard so much. He had heard so much and so many blasphemous things that Saul thought this man was guilty of. So he dedicated his life to try and stamp out this ridiculous cause. He says, and this is just what I did in Jerusalem. Boy, all you have to do is read about the story of Stephen in chapter 7, how Stephen was taken out and he was stoned because he was a Christian. And the garments of those who were doing the stoning were laid at the feet of a young man named Saul. This man right here. Now what I realized he actually was the official witness of the Sanhedrin. The official that came from that court that would be the one that would record this death and put it in their annals of history as a righteous deed. He says, it's what I did in Jerusalem. Not only did I lock up many of the saints in prison, having received authority from the chief priests, but also when they were being put to death, I cast my vote against them. And that's what he did with Stephen. He was the one that officially gave the check mark on that death of Stephen, the first Christian martyr. He says, and as I punished them often in all the synagogues, I tried to force them to blaspheme. And being furiously enraged at them, I kept pursuing them, even to foreign cities. It was his mission in life to cause grief and misery to anyone who believed what these people believed. But the Lord came to him and said, Saul, why are you doing this to me? It helps us to understand that even though the Lord was at the right hand of God in the heavens, he was feeling every pain that his people had. It's hard for us to imagine that unless we hear a story about a family in a car with rocks falling on it and one of their loved ones being killed by that massive slide. Then we begin to understand how God can hurt when his people hurt. We have so many incidents like that in our lives. So many things that happen to us like that, that we should be able to understand how important it is for us to learn how to mourn. how to have remorse. Do you know the difference between mourning and remorse? Is remorse mourning? Well, yeah, it is. Is mourning remorse? Well, maybe and maybe not. It's like the difference between iron and steel. Is steel iron? Yes. Is iron steel? No. There's a difference because they have some of the same ingredients. Remorse is sorrow because of what we've done. Sorrow is just sorrow. Doesn't matter who did it. Doesn't matter what the cause. Sorrow is different. So when Jesus said, "Blessed are those who mourn," He's not talking necessarily about remorse. It includes remorse. But it has to do with our ability to feel for others. To be able to mourn when someone else mourns. And the Apostle Paul speaks and writes in Romans chapter 12 that we should have, as Christians, the ability to weep with those who weep and rejoice with those who rejoice. Honestly, I find it a lot easier to weep with those who weep. Because I find a jealous streak in me sometimes. That I'm jealous that someone else got something good that I didn't get. Please don't make me be the only one that feels that way at times. I see someone who does not in any way, shape, or form deserve God's blessings, getting blessings that I don't get. I'm sorry, I get green sometimes. I wonder, why? Why? The ability to rejoice, to feel with people what they feel is very important for us as Christians. Because it's with that we can have the sympathy and the empathy for people when they need our comfort and our care. So Paul writes in Ephesians chapter 3, he's not feeling any guilt now. But Paul is still feeling the sorrow for what he had done. He said, "To me, the very least of all saints, this grace was given to preach to the Gentiles the unfathomable riches of Christ." Why did he say that way? Why did he call himself the very least of all saints? Because he told Agrippa that his very goal in life was to make their lives miserable if they were going to follow Christ. Now he was forgiven of the guilt, but he was not relieved of the sorrow that comes from having done that. We need to feel sorrow. Sorrow not necessarily because we did anything, but because of the consequence. I had nothing to do with that family traveling in that car. But I feel for them. I understand how miserable their lives must be now, having lost someone in such a crazy way. Such an unexpected loss of life and misery. So when Paul says, the very least of all saints, this grace was given, who deserves? Who deserves to have a position like Paul had? A position where he is entrusted with the fate and the salvation of thousands of people around the world. God put that in the hands of someone who had tortured his own people. Which should let us know, which should teach us when we read about this story that there is not one of us who cannot be a servant or I don't want to call it profitable, but someone who does something that God really appreciates. Saul of Tarsus, I don't know how many he killed. When you read the book of Hebrews, the writer of Hebrews, and I know there are a lot of people that disagree with me, but I think Paul wrote that secretly. Either he or Barnabas. One, could have been either one of them, but I kind of have an idea it was Paul. No writers mentioned. But there are so many things in there that make me think that this was someone who was on the other side at one time. Because he says, remember the former days. Remember the former days when you gave up so much, when you had property taken away from you, when you had your friends and your relatives imprisoned and you went to visit them and all of these things that happened. Remember those former days so that you don't give up. So it kind of sounds to me like somebody had a hand in some of the things that took place. But now this man who was that is now given the responsibility and the privilege of suffering for the cause of Christ. How much do you think he thought about? How much do you think he pondered the misery that he caused to all of those that he met? You know, when he went back to Jerusalem, 3 years after his conversion, he wanted to join the disciples. He was so excited to be a part of them. They didn't want anything to do with this guy. I can understand that. They did not trust him. It took Barnabas, the one with the nickname, Barnabas, son of encouragement. It took that guy who everybody trusted to stand with Paul and take him to the disciples, and then they accepted him. Mostly. He never was completely accepted, which was part of the consequences of his actions. You know, when they killed Uncle Mo, that kind of makes everybody go, whoa, I don't want anything to do with this guy. And even years and years later, he was still fighting that same reputation. In 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 7, I want us to think about this, what Marshall Keeble, the old black preacher, called the stairway to heaven. You know, I use this frequently, most of you know. This stairway to heaven starts with our initial faith in Jesus, and then we want to get it right, so we start learning what's right, to add to your faith moral excellence, and to your moral excellence knowledge, and to your knowledge self-control, and to your self-control perseverance. Stick with it. And to your perseverance godliness. That is the proper attitude. Don't get a big head over this now. And to your godliness brotherly kindness. And then the very pinnacle of this is Christian love. But I want to talk about brotherly kindness here for a minute. Where did the word kindness come from? Kindness. It's kind of a, where did that word get its meaning? Where did it come up with? How did we come up with the fact that means to treat people good? Well, because it comes from the word kind. Well, yeah, you say, yeah, duh. But the word kind has a different meaning than we have now. It originated in Genesis chapter 1 as after their own kind. Now, that means alike. It means the same as. That you treat people when you have kindness, it means you treat people like they are your own, like they're the same as you, like you do people that are yours, your kin, or your kindred. All of those words come from the same word. So brotherly kindness is the way you treat your brother. Well, the way you're supposed to treat your brother. I wasn't that kind to my brother. And poor little guy, man, I'm telling you. He was 6 years younger than I was. So that tells you something right there. I never was real kind to my little brother. I was supposed to do the dishes every day. Well, Ronnie wanted to go with me so bad. He was such a little tyke. He wanted to go with me so bad. I'd promised him he could go with me if he had washed the dishes for me, because that was my job, and I was passing it off to my underling. Well, little Ronnie, he standing on a stool. He could just barely get his arms in the sink, so he is washing dishes all morning long. And then when it was time to go, I'd tell him, no, you can't go. You got to stay home. Then he'd try to follow me, and I threw rocks at him. And I mean, I don't know why he still loves me. I wouldn't love me if it was me. That's not brotherly kindness. That's brotherly meanness right there. But the concept is you treat people like you do your own. That's what brotherly kindness is all about. That means feeling their pain. One of the best pictures I've ever seen that deals with this concept of brotherly kindness came from it was an ad that was done back in the 20s or 30s. I wasn't around then. Trust me, I'm not that old. But back in the days of what they called Boys Town, it was an orphanage for a children's orphanage. So there was a picture that they had two little boys. One was probably 7 or 8 years old, and the other was 3 or 4 years old. And the 7-year-old had the 3-year-old on his back. And the caption on the picture said, "He's not heavy, he's my brother." Man, I get teared up every time I see that, because that is the picture of brotherly kindness. The way we treat our own. So, the Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 12 and verse 14 says this: "Bless those who persecute you. Bless and curse not." He said, "Rejoice with those who rejoice, and weep with those who weep." Being able to see and to feel what others feel, we would have to look at our Lord Jesus. One of the stories that I am most impressed with is the story of Lazarus in John chapter 11. When Jesus was told that his friend, Lazarus, was sick, they expected the Lord to drop whatever he was doing and hurry and come so you can save him. Like they thought that he had to be there at the time and be able to touch him to save him. In verse 32 of John chapter 11, it says this: "Therefore, when Mary came where Jesus was, she saw him, and she fell at his feet, saying, 'Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died.'" I want you to think about this for a minute. The Lord waited 4 days to go. So Lazarus died, and 4 days later, the Lord shows up. You can see why Mary was crying. You can see why she was feeling so hurt. Your friend, you could have saved him had you been here. Where were you? What were you doing? So when Jesus therefore saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and was troubled. And he said, "Where have you laid him?" And they said, "Come here, Lord, and see." Then we have the shortest verse in the Bible. I don't know who picked those two words to be a verse, but well, I do know two. I can't remember the Frenchman's name, but he's the one that made these into verses. Jesus wept. What was so special about this? It wasn't the fact that Lazarus died. That wasn't why the Lord was weeping. The Lord could fix that. All the Lord had to do was speak, and that was fixed. It wasn't the fact that Lazarus died, because the Lord told his disciples, the reason I waited is so that people could see the power of God and see that I had been entrusted with that power of God. No, the reason Jesus, our Lord, was weeping is because this affected his people so drastically, because it caused them so much sorrow. He understood how life and death are matters that cause us to weep and to mourn. So, the effect that all of this has on others. In 2 Corinthians chapter 2, we have a story of someone in the church at Corinth. Now, you got to understand the church at Corinth. It starts out as a bad place and it gets worse from there. This is a church where in every chapter in 1 Corinthians, the Lord rebukes them, or Paul, I'll get it right in a minute. Paul rebukes them for something. Then in the second book of Corinthians, it's a totally different picture because they listened in the first one. But here's what Paul writes to this church in 2 Corinthians chapter 2. Now, the reason he's writing this, there was an event. I don't know what this was all about, except I know it was horrible. That a guy was living with his father's wife. Doesn't say his mother, it says his father's wife. I'm not sure what that means, except that nobody found this acceptable. Not even the Greeks did this. So he's doing something that's shaming everyone, especially the Lord. Paul writes this to these people after telling them in 1 Corinthians, I want you to withdraw yourselves from that man. Don't have anything to do with him until he recognizes that he's wrong. I want you to deliver him to Satan for the destruction of his person and the salvation of his soul. Not everybody did it, but most of them did. Here's what he says. But I determined this for my own sake, that I would not come to you in sorrow again. Seems like everything he wrote to them in 1 Corinthians was sorrow, sorrow, sorrow. He's beating them up. Every time he writes something, he's beating them up because they just can't seem to get it right. He says, I determined I was not going to come to you in sorrow again. For if I cause you sorrow, who then makes me glad but the one whom I made sorrowful? There's only one way I can get happy, and that is if you do the right thing. He said, but this very thing I wrote, so that when I came I would not have sorrow from those who ought to make me rejoice. Have you ever noticed in every case of conversion in the New Testament, it was surrounded by joy? Exaltation, not exaltation, but it comes from the Greek word, or the Latin word that means to leap and jump and shout for joy. That's what happened when people were converted. But these people who were supposed to be Paul's joy and his exaltation were actually his grief. He mourned more for these people than he could rejoice for them. He says, I wrote so that when I came I would not have sorrow from those who ought to make me rejoice, having confidence in you all that my joy would be the joy of you all. He says, I want us all to be happy about the same things, but we can't be happy when there's a reason to be sorrowful, when there's a reason to mourn. And that's what Jesus meant when he said, blessed are those who mourn. He's not wanting crybabies. He's not wanting people who are always poor me. He's wanting people who have the ability to mourn when it's necessary, to recognize the suffering that sin brings into our world. He says, for out of much affliction and anguish of heart, I wrote to you with many tears. Can you see how Saul now is grieving over the very people he tried to destroy early on? How now his whole attitude, his whole person is different. Now he's not furiously enraged at them. Now he's mourning over their spiritual loss. He says that you might know the love which I have especially for you. But if any has caused sorrow. Now let's stop and think about this for a minute. This man does something that he probably had this conversation with himself. Shouldn't have. Well, no, yeah. And he decided to go ahead and do the wrong thing, and he knew it was wrong. Everybody knew it was wrong. He did it, and it caused sorrow not just to him, but everybody that knew about it. Now, how do you deal with this man? How do you treat him? Paul says, don't even eat with such a one. Don't have him over for dinner. That was an important thing to him in those days. Still is. Still is. Having dinner with folks. I don't know when I've had so much fun as I have when I sit down at table with some of you. To have that taken away from me would be a drastic thing. Paul says, don't eat with him. Okay, so he says, I want you to know the love which I have especially for you. But if any has caused sorrow, he's caused sorrow not to me, but in some degree, in order not to say too much, he's caused sorrow to everyone. Sufficient for such a one is this punishment which was inflicted by the majority. Not everybody took part in it. Not everybody followed Paul's advice. But the ones that did, it caused him sorrow and caused him to turn. He says, so that on the contrary, you should rather forgive and comfort him now that he's repented, now that he's changed his actions, now that he has come back to the Lord. Forgive him. Forgive him and take him back. He says, otherwise, such a one might be overwhelmed by excessive sorrow. You know, you can grieve to death. It is possible. Paul says, don't destroy the man when he has come back and when he's trying to do the right thing. Have those feelings of forgiveness. He says, wherefore I urge you to reaffirm your love for him. For to this end I also wrote that I might put you to the test whether you're obedient in all things. You know, sometimes as God's people, we kind of enjoy the punishment part. That guy deserves that. Are we as willing to take someone back and forgive them when they turn around and they do the right thing? Or are we still wanting to punish them? Are we still wanting to make them a second-class citizen because you did that? That's what they tried to do to Saul. You did that. Well, yes, I did. And the Lord forgave me. And I have now this grace given to me to preach the gospel to the Gentiles. The Jews never did quite accept that fully. Now, what he's saying to these people, you were obedient in punishing him. Now let's see if you can be obedient in restoring him and reestablishing your love for this man. Feeling for others is what it's all about. I also want to talk about the contrast there is in in feeling remorse for the things we've done and the feelings that Jesus had for us when he had done nothing wrong and we did something to him. I want to talk about that next time. But if you know that your life does not fit this kind of sorrow that the Bible talks about, that we're supposed to have eagerly as Christians, make your life right today. Will you have that epiphany that Paul had? Will you have the same epiphany that David had? We'll talk about David next time. How David woke up to the fact that he was what he despised in other men. If you're subject to the gospel call this morning, would you make your life right? Come as we stand and sing the song that Mel has for us.